immediately establishing a central pawn and opening diagonals for piece development, setting the stage for dynamic play. Developing this knight immediately offers flexibility, preparing to challenge the center and potentially launch an early queenside expansion. Asserting central space immediately, white aims to restrict black's knight and prepare a queenside pawn surge. Opening the diagonal for the queen and preparing for kingside castling creates solid central pawn control. Developing the knight to c3 solidifies central control and prepares for further pawn advances, subtly restricting black's options. Asserting central presence, black challenges white's pawn structure and opens lines for development. Asserting influence along the diagonal, this bishop prepares to challenge black's central pawn structure by potentially pinning the knight. Simplifying the structure and preparing for pawn breaks, this choice avoids immediate tactical fireworks for a solid pawn center. Solidifying the center and preparing development, this move elegantly reinforces the d4 pawn while opening a path for the king's bishop, aiming for harmonious piece placement. Developing the knight here reinforces central pawn structure and prepares to support the c6 advance, fostering a robust pawn chain. Consolidating the center and preparing for castling, this move is a cornerstone of solid queen's gambit decline development, aiming for harmonious piece placement and a well-protected monarch. Securing the king with castling is a fundamental priority, and black wisely chooses to tuck their monarch away behind a pawn shield, a necessary prerequisite before engaging in any deeper strategic maneuvering or pawn pushes. Positioning the rook on the c-file anticipates potential pawn breaks or piece activity in that sector, preparing for a more dynamic midfield battle and potentially opening lines toward black's kingside if the pawn structure shifts. Securing the queenside flank is the primary goal here, preventing any immediate knight incursions to b4 or c5, and preparing for potential queenside expansion later. Striking the center resolves pawn tension, simplifying the position and opening the c-file for potential queenside pressure. Watch for how black repositions their pieces after this exchange to counter any arising activity. Exchanging pawns in the center immediately opens up diagonals for your bishop, and while it relinquishes some central pawn presence, it prepares for a more active piece play, aiming to exploit the now clear lines towards white's queenside. Asserting queenside influence, the queen targets the pawn, creating immediate pressure and forcing a reaction. This clever maneuver aims to disrupt black's developing harmony and potentially exploit any weaknesses on that flank. White is actively looking to improve their piece coordination, especially the rooks on the open c-file. Solidifying the center and preparing a queenside expansion, c6 anchors the pawn chain and prepares to support a potential b5 push, creating a sound structure against white's central influence. Positioning the bishop here aims to bolster the kingside defense and prepare for potential kingside action, while also eyeing the central squares and creating a harmonious battery with the queen. Boldly repositioning the knight to the edge, black initiates a fascinating maneuver that aims to provoke white's bishop and potentially disrupt the queenside pawn structure, while simultaneously creating a long-term outpost possibility on f4 or g3. This aggressive flair contrasts with the otherwise solid development, introducing an element of surprise and challenging white to react precisely. Unburdening the bishop from its pinning duty frees up a dynamic potential for white's queen and rooks, aiming to exert pressure along the d-file and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure should the knight opt for a less harmonious retreat. A queen repositioning, aiming to challenge white's central influence and potentially prepare a queenside expansion, while also unpinning the knight and opening diagonal access for its own pieces. Castling now anchors the king securely behind a nascent pawn shield, initiating the long-term strategic game plan after a sharp tactical exchange. Restoring the knight to a more central, active square is a sensible repositioning, preparing to reinforce the kingside defense and potentially launch a queenside counterplay, though it does concede some initiative by allowing white's pieces to gain better influence over key central squares. Repositioning the knight to the edge of the board might seem odd, but it aims to prepare a future advance of the b-pawn, potentially creating queenside space and attacking opportunities by bolstering the c4 square. Alternatively, this knight might be heading for a more active post, perhaps c5, to disrupt black's setup or eye weak pawns. It's a subtle maneuver, seeking to outflank black's defenses rather than engage directly in the center. A bold maneuver, e4, thrusts the knight into a powerful central outpost, directly challenging white's queenside structure and eyeing the potentially exposed f2 square. This aggressive positioning immediately creates complications, forcing white to consider how to dislodge or neutralize this disruptive piece, potentially leading to pawn weaknesses or tactical skirmishes. Clearing the way for the queen to access the open c-file, this exchange sacrifices the bishop's influence on the long diagonal for immediate tactical clarity, forcing black to decide whether to recapture with the knight, potentially disrupting their central pawn structure, or to allow white's queen to dominate the queenside. Reclaiming the queen to the center reestablishes a powerful attacking presence, aiming to exploit the now slightly vulnerable dark squares around white's king, while simultaneously preparing to challenge the open c-file. White is now aiming to exploit the weakened d-file after black's queen moved, potentially forcing exchanges to activate the queen on the queen side or to apply pressure on the central pawns. Returning the queen to the king side, QG6 seeks to consolidate a slightly awkward outpost on f6, potentially preparing for a knight repositioning or offering a retreat should the e4 square become untenable. Sharpening the initiative, white repositions the queen to control the 7th rank, a bold maneuver aiming to disrupt black's nascent queenside buildup and potentially exploit the king's somewhat exposed central placement. This aggressive advance signifies a shift towards more direct confrontation, challenging black to find precise defensive resources or risk a cascade of tactical complications. Securing the kingside pawn structure solidifies your defensive setup and prepares for potential counterplay, offering a much-needed shield against any immediate threats stemming from white's queen and bishop placement. Shifting the rook to the 3rd rank now aims to exert pressure along the c-file, aiming to dislodge black's potentially troublesome knight from its active outpost and prepare for potential advances on the king side or a central breakthrough. Returning the queen to e8 surrenders the central file control and cedes initiative on the queen side, potentially inviting further pressure along the c-file where white's rook is already well placed. Shifting the queen to d6 opens new avenues for attack while simultaneously reinforcing the central pawn chain. This maneuver aims to create immediate pressure on black's queenside and prepare for a potential kingside advance by repositioning pieces for optimal coordination. Relocating the rook to the 7th rank aims to penetrate white's defenses and potentially disrupt their queenside structure, simultaneously creating a safety net for the king and preparing for future queenside activity, though it does invite further pressure on the d-file. A potent assertion of control over the c-file, preparing to challenge black's pawn structure and potentially generate breakthroughs. Seeking a safe haven, the queen retreats from the aggressive central pressure, abandoning the b-file's potential dominance and leaving the kingside slightly less defended against white's growing influence. The exchange of queens, a decisive pivot, transforms the strategic landscape from intricate maneuvering to a stark assessment of pawn structures and potential king activity. King repositioning now becomes paramount, bringing the monarch into the fray to support the advancing pawns and contest central space, while simultaneously guarding against potential pawn weaknesses that might arise from the impending queenless skirmish. A delicate repositioning of the knight aims to free the central pawns and prepare for potential pawn advances or rerouting towards the kingside, subtly shifting the balance by activating a piece that was previously somewhat hemmed in. The monarch bravely ventures toward the center, a calculated risk as open files begin to emerge, aiming to connect the rooks and solidify the defensive structure, while simultaneously preparing for the inevitable pawn pushes on the queenside that will surely arise. Consolidating pieces around the nascent central pawn island is the immediate objective, preparing for a more robust pawn push or strategic deployment of the rook. Shifting the rook to the b-file aims to contest open lines and potentially exert pressure on white's queenside pawn structure, while also preparing for a more active role in the developing endgame. Solidifying the kingside structure, this move prevents any immediate pawn advances or infiltrations by the black knight, creating a more secure defensive setup for white's monarch, while also preparing a potential pawn break on e4 down the line to contest the center more actively. Repositioning the rook to the d-file is a flexible maneuver, aiming to secure vital central space and potentially launch a pawn storm on the kingside, while simultaneously preparing for a potential queenside pawn advance by the opponent. Securing the monarch's sanctuary becomes paramount as the central files begin to soften. The knight's retreat to f8 aims to redeploy into the central fight, potentially swinging over to the kingside or reinforcing the d7 square if the need arises, showcasing a flexible regrouping maneuver. Securing the b-file and projecting pressure towards black's queenside pawns, this rook maneuver aims to restrict piece mobility while preparing for potential pawn advances. A strategic repositioning, the knight embarks on a journey from the flank to the center, aiming to occupy the critical d7 square and provide support for future operations. Emboldening the pawn structure opens aggressive attacking lines, but potentially weakens the kingside considerably, a daring gamble to pry open the position for piece activity. This pawn push aggressively challenges white's queenside structure, seeking to unravel the position and gain valuable space on the queenside, potentially creating weaknesses in white's pawn chain. Targeting the queenside majority with a bold knight maneuver, this push aggressively probes black's pawn structure and prepares for potential breakthroughs on the flank. Black seeks to activate the knight and challenge white's queenside initiative by preparing to contest the open c-file, potentially leading to a strategic regrouping of forces and a shift in initiative. Shifting the knight to this square aims to disrupt black's newly established queenside pawn structure and potentially create an outpost for the knight on c6. Black immediately seeks to exploit the open c-file by bringing the bishop to a more active diagonal and threatening to create complications with the rook, aiming to unbalance the otherwise static position. Seizing the open file with the knight offers a dynamic shift, aiming to exploit black's slightly passive knight placement and potentially open lines for further piece activity. Reclaiming the open file and establishing a central presence are the immediate aims after recapturing. A bold gambit appears, aiming to disrupt black's position by sacrificing a pawn to seize control of the c-file and create immediate pressure against the b-pawn. A daring attempt to seize queenside initiative, but this pawn thrust opens a critical diagonal for white's bishop and risks isolating the pawn, potentially creating a permanent weakness. Unlocking the open file creates a potent attacking avenue, directly threatening to penetrate black's vulnerable queenside pawn structure and potentially splitting white's forces apart. Recapturing the pawn opens the file and creates immediate counterplay, forcing white to defend their vulnerable d-pawn and consider the pressure on the queenside. Recapturing the rook solidifies control over the b-file, a crucial conduit for potential pawn pushes and piece activity in this materially balanced, yet positionally tense endgame, demanding a keen eye for pawn structure weaknesses. A crucial decision point arrives as black recaptures the piece, fundamentally altering the material balance and ushering in a new phase of the game. Consolidating material gains by removing the passed pawn, white seeks to exploit the cramped nature of black's remaining queenside pawns.